Like it was like something subconsciously, like I had to do it.
Did you feel anger?
At certain moments, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Long Branch is a coastal city in New Jersey known for its historic beaches, vibrant boardwalk and quaint neighbourhoods. Its history dates back to the 18th century when it was originally a summer resort for the wealthy residents of New York and Philadelphia. It was even a gateway for presidents, earning it the nickname the nation's summer capital. The city's nestled along the Atlantic Ocean and it still serves as a popular summer destination, but has a population of around 33,000. Among these residents are families that live along Wall Street, a residential neighbourhood dotted with large homes and well-manicured gardens. As the final hours of 2017 ticked away, the families of Wall Street gathered at their homes, eager to welcome in the new year together. Children were allowed to stay up late for this night only, while their parents toasted with champagne or a bottle of beer. Outside, the night was crisp and still, except for the occasional crackle of distant fireworks. But just before midnight, a sudden burst of sound shattered the calm. The pop of fireworks was abruptly drowned out by a series of sharp, deafening bangs. The sounds weren't celebratory, they were gunshots, and they were coming from one of the homes on Wall Street. Stephen Kologi was a lifelong resident of Long Branch, New Jersey, where he worked for most of his 44 years as a mailman. Known for his passion for sports, Stephen played softball in several leagues and took pride in his bodybuilding. He also dedicated his time to coaching youth baseball, but his greatest joy came from being a father. Stephen and his 42-year-old wife, Linda, shared a close-knit family with 3 children: 20-year-old Stephen Jr., 18-year-old Brittany, and 16-year-old Scott. Additionally, they had raised Linda's 25-year-old son, Jonathan Ruiz, from a previous relationship. Linda had grown up in foster care in Jersey City after she lost her parents at a young age. She had settled in Long Branch in early 1990s, where she married Stephen in 1997. Linda was deeply devoted to her family, spending her life caring for her children. Her cousin described the Kologis as a loving, fun family who enjoyed spending time together. They were familiar faces at local softball games and the Welsh Farms convenience store, where they often brought lottery tickets. By 2017, the Kologi family lived in a red brick home along Wall Street in Long Branch. Although the house was a decent size, it felt cramped with all of the children, except Jonathan, still living at home. Jonathan had his own place in Toms River, where he ran a wireless technology business. Brittany, the family's only daughter, had recently begun her freshman year at Stockton University, where she was studying health science and making friends with ease. Stephen Kologi was the sole provider for his family, often working multiple jobs to make ends meet. His friend, Ronnie Paccio, recalled how Stephen tirelessly took on long shifts. Some midnight to 9 in the morning, he did everything and anything to support his family. After years of working for the US Postal Service, Stephen transitioned to Kellogg's warehouse in Cranberry, where he learned the company's shipping and delivery services. He even secured a job for his son, Stephen Jr. Stephen's manager, Roger Daniels, described him as a hard-working man who stayed away from workplace drama and was always committed to doing the best. However, in 2017, both Stephen and his son lost their jobs when Kellogg closed the Cranberry warehouse. It was a devastating blow to the family, who was already burdened with financial hardships. They'd been struggling for years, facing a pending foreclosure on their home, which they purchased in 2002 for $160,000. Over the years, the family had taken out multiple mortgages, and in 2009 the couple filed for bankruptcy. They owed over $72,000 on credit cards and leasing a Honda Civic for $15,000. Despite their struggles, however, Stephen and Linda remained dedicated to their children. They were known for their generosity, often hosting barbecues and welcoming their children's friends into their home. Linda, who had worked as a bus driver for the public schools, had been collecting unemployment while caring for their 16-year-old son, Scott. He had suffered from developmental delays in learning speech and social skills. By the time he was 3, he was already undergoing therapy to address his problems. An MRI scan had showed an abnormality in Scott's brain. His family believed that it was a tumour, but doctors concluded it was most likely an area of gliosis, an abnormality caused by brain damage where dense, fibrous networks of cells accumulated. As Scott grew, people noticed that he had a flat affect. He didn't seem to understand the consequences of the things that he would say. His aunt, Michelle Molyneux, said he lacked empathy. Whenever somebody died, Scott would respond by shrugging and saying, "It happens." Some family members were sure that Scott was on the autism spectrum, but he was never diagnosed. Instead, he was diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. But then the hallucinations began. Around the age of 7, Scott started to hear voices from his classmates and his teachers, although there was nobody there. He saw faces, including one of a woman who sat on his bed and turned from red to black. Eventually, Linda began homeschooling Scott after he struggled in the traditional school system. He'd faced relentless bullying, and he had difficulty making friends. As a child, Scott had been quiet and reserved, but once he began homeschooling, he blossomed into a more outgoing and humorous teenager, somebody who was easier to interact with. He still had his mood swings, however, where he would go from very happy to very upset at the drop of a hat, or suddenly erupt into laughter. He would get lost in his own mind, sometimes for as long as an hour, without realising how much time had passed. Scott even sometimes had to be shaken back into reality. Though he had typical teenage dreams, such as wanting a girlfriend, thinking about college or the military, Scott wasn't like the other kids his age. He loved watching children's cartoons, often slept in his parents' bed, needed to be dressed each morning, and he still believed in Santa Claus. On New Year's Eve of 2017, the atmosphere in Long Branch, New Jersey, was filled with excitement and anticipation. Local businesses, especially bars, were preparing for the night's festivities, advertising their events and drawing crowds, ready to ring in the new year. That morning, Linda Kologi, like many days before, visited Welsh Farms convenience store across from the family's home. She picked up a bottle of water and a lottery ticket, a small hope amidst the family's ongoing financial struggles. Meanwhile, her husband Stephen stopped by Flavo's liquor store 3 blocks away to grab his usual, a 6-pack of Miller Lite and a pack of Newport cigarettes. According to cashier Nick Patel, it was just like any other day. The Kologi family household was busy that evening, with all the family members and a few guests gathered to celebrate the new year. Brittany had come home from Stockton University for the holidays, and Stephen's father, Adrian, was there with his long-term girlfriend, 70-year-old Mary Schultz. Mary was more like a grandmother to the Kologi children, and was described by the family as Adrian's soulmate. They'd been together for decades. Mary was a retired human resource specialist, and she was well loved in the community for her warm presence and dedication to preserving local history. She served on the board of the Monmouth County Genealogy Society and co-founded its African American Special Interest Group. She was also a passionate actress in community theatre and committed to restoring local cemeteries. Joining the family's festivities that night was Stephen Jr.'s girlfriend, Rafaela Bontempo. She'd been invited over for the annual New Year's Eve party that Stephen and Linda hosted every year. As the night unfolded, excitement filled the home, with everybody preparing to welcome in the new year. But this celebration would end in tragedy. About 15 minutes before midnight, Wall Street resident Sergio Diaz stepped outside to grab a few beers from his porch. The familiar sound of fireworks crackled in the sky, lighting up the neighbourhood. But amidst the burst of colour, a strange, unsettling pop echoed in the air. Then came several more. Sergio froze. These weren't fireworks. They were gunshots. Seconds before the gunshot shattered the peaceful neighbourhood of Long Branch, the Kologi family was preparing for midnight, ready to welcome 2018. In the living room, everyone wore party hats and sunglasses, laughter filling the air as Linda handed out party favours. But then, she noticed that Scott wasn't there. He'd slipped away to his bedroom, unnoticed in the excitement. Concerned for her 16-year-old son, Linda headed upstairs to check on him. There was only 15 minutes before midnight, and she wanted the family to ring in the new year together. Moments later, however, a loud pop echoed through the home, startling everybody that remained downstairs. At first, they thought it might have been a party popper, but then more shots followed in quick succession. Panic gripped the room. Everyone scrambled as gunfire tore through the ceiling. Rafaela recalled.
First, there was a pop. Everything acted very fast, but we thought for a second it might have been party poppers, but more shots after that. And Linda screamed. And that's when Big Steven Sr. ran upstairs. And everybody scrambled to get out of the house.
Instinct took over. Most rushed to the kitchen, huddling in a corner in terror. But Stephen ran up the stairs, determined to confront whatever was happening, while Stephen Jr. bolted outside. In the kitchen, Rafaela, Brittany, Adrian and Mary huddled together, their breaths shallow as they tried to make sense of the chaos. Had somebody broken in and opened fire? They heard a few more pops, and seconds later, they could hear somebody descending the stairs. A figure emerged. They were dressed in all black and were wearing black sunglasses. They carried a rifle. It was 16-year-old Scott. He was wearing his Terminator Halloween costume, the same one he'd worn months earlier. Only now, it felt terrifyingly real. Without hesitation, Scott raised the rifle and opened fire. Mary and Brittany fell to the floor as Rafaela cowered behind the refrigerator and frantically called 911 as her hands trembled. She tried to stay quiet, barely able to get the words out. She was terrified that Scott would hear her. Glancing around the refrigerator, she saw Adrian lying protectively over Mary, trying to shield her with his body. She was motionless, blood soaking her clothes, while Adrian raised his hands and pleaded silently with his grandson. Scott looked at his grandfather, then glanced at the bodies of his sister and Mary, and without a word, he walked away. Rafaela, who was still on the phone with 911, whispered the family's address, her voice shaking. Outside, Stephen Jr. had run down the block, also calling 911. He had witnessed his younger brother calmly walk downstairs and open fire into the kitchen. With desperation in his voice, he told the operator, "He's still shooting my family right now. He's still up there. His name is Scott Kologi." The 911 operators quickly dispatched detectives and officers to the Kologi home, racing against the clock to reach the scene of the deadly shooting. Officer Charles Wells was among the first to arrive, his weapon drawn as he cautiously entered the home. Blood trailed up the stairs, leading to a grim sight. Stephen's body, crumpled awkwardly on the staircase, motionless. Further up, Linda lay on the landing, just outside Scott's bedroom door. The home, which had just earlier been filled with the joy of celebration, was now eerily silent, save for the faint sound of police radios crackling. Officer Wells and his team entered Scott's bedroom. There, amidst the chaos, they found Scott, sitting calmly on his bed, petting the family dog as though nothing had happened. Outside, the scene was a stark contrast to the quiet horror inside. The media had begun to gather, flanked by worried neighbours who were still shaken by the night's events. New Year's Eve had drawn nearly everyone outdoors to enjoy the fireworks. But now those same fireworks were overshadowed by police sirens and flashing lights. The celebrations had come to a halt, replaced by an overwhelming sense of dread. One neighbour, James Roskanowski, spoke with reporters recounting the scene earlier. He said, "I walked outside at midnight. We heard the commotion and saw the lights flashing, then saw the police storm the house. It's a shame the new year has to start off like this." Scott Kologi was promptly ordered to be held on 4 counts of murder and possession of a weapon. In his brief court appearance, prosecutor Christopher Gramicioni addressed the severity of the crimes. Due to the gravity of the situation, Scott was expected to be tried as an adult. The prosecutor also revealed that the weapon used in the attack was legally owned. A powerful AK-style Century Arms rifle registered to Scott's brother, Stephen Jr. Stephen Jr. had kept the rifle in his bedroom closet, alongside 1,000 rounds of ammunition and 2 empty 15-round magazines. His mother Linda had repeatedly asked him to store the weapon in a safe, but the safe's humidity had caused the gun to rust, so Stephen Jr. insisted on keeping it in the closet instead. Prosecutor Gramicioni voiced the tragic reality of the case, stating, "This is a heartbreaking family tragedy. The sad reality is that we seek justice for the remaining family members of those that died. Justice is likely going to involve serious punishment for yet another family member." As the decision on whether to charge Scott as an adult loomed, those who knew the Kologi family were left in disbelief. Joe Reyes, a close family friend, reflected on the tragedy, stating, "He was always smiling, not a violent kid or anything like that." Linda's cousin Walter expressed his own devastation, grappling with why Scott would commit such a horrifying act. He stated, "Why'd he do that to my cousin? Why would he kill his own mother? She was so good to that boy." He emphasised that although Scott had struggled with learning, he always seemed to know the difference between right and wrong. What shocked everybody the most was the fact that Scott had orphaned himself, severing the only source of love and support he had ever known. Still, beneath the shock, there were whispers. Some people who knew the family weren't entirely surprised. There had been signs that something was brewing beneath the surface. They were all ignored. In October of 2017, just 2 months before the murders, Scott Kologi made a chilling comment that would later haunt his aunt and uncle. They were sitting around the table, playing a game of Clue, a gift that his mother had recently purchased him. As Scott picked up the miniature toy revolver from the game, he pointed it at his aunt, Michelle, and casually said, "I'm going to kill you." Then, with the same calmness, he pointed it at his uncle, Rich, adding, "And kill you, after I come down from upstairs after taking Mum and Dad out." To those who knew Scott well, this wasn't just a passing remark. For years, Scott had been harbouring dark thoughts, and what made it even more unsettling was that he had been frighteningly open about them. He frequently confided in his mother Linda, telling her that he was having homicidal thoughts. These weren't vague musings, but deeply specific imaginings. He'd once told his mother that he fantasized about killing a neighbour who had bullied him in the past. One day he even went as far as to wrap his hand around Rafaela's throat during a casual moment and chillingly remarked, "It would be so easy to choke you." But Scott had been painfully aware of his unravelling mental state. He had pleaded with his mother to let him see a therapist to get help before it was too late. But Linda had always refused, afraid that her son would be taken away and locked in a loony bin, as she put it. She told her son to keep his thoughts to himself. Scott, who was torn between his desire for help and his fear of institutionalisation, told her that he didn't want to hurt anybody, but there might come a time when he wouldn't be able to stop himself. This wasn't a secret burden that Scott bore alone. He had a confidant, his grandfather Adrian. Scott had always seemed to care deeply for his grandfather, often visiting him daily to help him out around the house, since his grandfather had used a walker. Adrian had been diagnosed with schizophrenia earlier in life, and he understood some of the darkness that Scott had described. He tried to help his grandson, sharing his own experiences with hallucinations and telling Scott to find ways to distract himself. For a time, it seemed to work. Scott would immerse himself in music, read, or take long showers to help keep the thoughts at bay, but they always returned, darker and more persistent than before. Michelle, Scott's aunt, had overheard multiple conversations between Scott and Linda, where he expressed his violent urges. In one especially harrowing exchange, Scott told his mother that he might have to hurt her. Linda tried to comfort him, telling her son that he would never harm her. But Scott's response was as cold as it was calculated. He said, "I'd have to, and then Dad would be second because he would be sad without Mum." Linda pushed further, asking what Scott would do about his sister Brittany. Scott's reply was chilling in his bluntness. He said he hated Brittany and she would have to die as well. As for his brother Stephen Jr., Scott explained that he would need to kill him as well, reasoning that he couldn't leave his brother alone without their parents. In one of the most disturbing conversations, Michelle asked Scott, half joking, if he would at least spare her and her husband Rich. Scott's response was devoid of any humour. He said, "No, of course, I would have to take you out, but I'd let Richie go home to his family." As the fall of 2017 progressed, Scott's comments became even more violent and frequent. His dark thoughts seemed to spiral out of control. One day he told his family with a disturbing sense of resignation, "I don't want to hurt anyone, but one day I might just have to." And that New Year's Eve, Scott finally acted on the thoughts that had consumed him for so long. The day after the shooting, Stephen Jr. took to Instagram to pay tribute to his family. He urged his friends to give the ones they love an extra kiss or tell them that they love them. He wrote, "I just wish I could tell all of them how much they meant to me and how much I truly loved each and every one of them, because I didn't do that enough." The post continued with Stephen Jr. saying that he had the best parents who provided for their children, even though they didn't have a lot of money. He wrote, "Never once was I without a hot meal or a roof over my head. They made sure Christmas came every year, although they struggled financially. I cannot even describe the type of people they were, so just believe me when I say how great they were." He described his sister as beautiful and smart, and wished his followers good luck for 2018. That evening, hundreds of people gathered in the below-freezing temperatures at Franklin Park in memory of the victims. Members of the Kologi family and the Schultz family came together and huddled beneath the gazebo as everybody else gathered in the front. Brittany's friend, Jania Gillard, described her as very energetic, artsy and always smiling. She said that she loved cats, especially her own cat Jill. She revealed that she last communicated with Brittany at 11:40 p.m, just a few minutes before she was killed. Brittany had sent her friend a picture of her lying with her cat, about to ring in the new year. She said to the crowd, "I love her and I'm thankful for everything she helped me through. I wouldn't be the person I am today without her." In the aftermath of the murders, Scott Kologi didn't deny what he had done. Seated in the interrogation room beside his older brother Stephen Jr., who was acting as his guardian, Scott explained the disturbing events that unfolded on New Year's Eve. "With what happened tonight, it just came out of nowhere," Scott told the detectives, his voice eerily calm. "I was questioning it, but I just couldn't stop," he said. Scott recounted that after watching Kong Skull Island with his family, he'd retreated to the bedroom. It was there that the dark thoughts he had battled for years began to resurface. He thought back to what he described as bad moments, particularly the bullying he had endured when he was younger. Overcome by these memories, he said he made a grim decision. He picked up his older brother's assault rifle and loaded both 15-round magazines meticulously, one bullet at a time. Scott revealed that he had learned how to load and operate the weapon by watching YouTube videos and playing violent video games. Once the rifle was ready, he donned his leather jacket from a past Halloween costume, where he had dressed as the Terminator, and placed earplugs in his ears. He turned off the lights in the bedroom, fully aware of what was coming next. Scott knew that his mother, Linda, would come and check on him before midnight, eager to have him join the family in watching the ball drop on television. When Linda entered the room, he shot her multiple times in the chest.
Alright, let me rewind a little bit. So upstairs, your mom walks in, right?
Opens the door. She didn't walk in yet.
So the gun was loaded already?
Yes.
How many times did you shoot her?
I would say 5, 7 times.
Where do you shoot her at? What part of the body?
And then, the torso and chest.
He knew that his father would immediately rush up the stairs at the sound of gunfire, and Stephen Sr. did just that. Scott shot his father in the back and torso, sending him tumbling down the stairs.
Alright, and then your father hears the shots and he comes up?
Yes, and then it was his back.
His back?
Yeah.
Alright, and then you walk down the steps.
Yeah.
With a gun loaded, and you go in the kitchen.
Yeah, and then the rest.
How many times do you shoot your sister?
3 times.
Where do you shoot her at?
Well, she was sitting down, so it was kind of chest and head region.
From there, Scott moved downstairs into the kitchen. He saw his sister Brittany and Mary in the kitchen. He aimed the rifle at Mary first, shooting her in the chest, then turned to Brittany and fired 3 rounds into her head. The scene was gruesome, but Scott only stopped shooting when he saw the anguish on his grandfather Adrian's face. Adrian cradled Mary's body as she bled out. It was at this moment that Scott, as he put it, snapped back to reality. He described the sensation of carrying out the murders as feeling otherworldly. He told the detectives that it was as though he wasn't physically present.
I know they're all, deceased.
How do you know that?
Even though it felt like I wasn't doing this physically, I was still able to see everything, and I would see them moving, and I just kept firing until they stopped moving. And I would aim at the head and whatnot.
So you're aiming at their heads?
Yeah, and when I saw they were still moving, because even though I was in this type of thing, I just didn't want them to be in pain at the same time.
Scott showed little remorse, acknowledging that he knew what he had done was wrong. He admitted that he should feel sad or guilty, but confessed, "I just don't feel a thing. It's just like another day for me." His detachment from the reality of the murders had left the detectives unnerved.
When you were loading the mags and when you were doing this,
I was questioning it, but I just couldn't stop. It was something subconsciously I had to do it.
Did you feel anger?
At certain moments, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
You said something before, and I want to make sure I
What?
remember it correctly to ask you about it. You said something about you weren't really mentally there.
No, like when everything was going down, like everything was happening, like it felt like I was watching it. Like it felt like I was like further back in my mind. Like I felt like I could still see it, and I knew I was doing it. It just felt like it wasn't me.
When pressed about his state of mind at the time, Scott was candid about the thoughts that had plagued him. He explained, "It's not that I have a personal vendetta against anyone, but just random stuff would pop up in my head, and sometimes it would be more frequent than others, and other times I'd be fine for a while."
Okay.
Yeah.
But yet you knew what you were doing.
Yeah.
You know what time this happened at, right? You remember the time?
It was around 12 because it was like
It was before
right,
New Year, right?
Ultra.
So it was around, what, 11:30, 12, around there?
I would say 11:58, 59. I don't know.
Did you do that on purpose?
What? I was thinking like around that time.
Like Happy New Year?
Yeah.
Type of-
yeah.
What time did you think of doing this? At? How long have you been
I
planning
don't
this?
know. But mainly today, like I just saw like,
Like, were you thinking about it all day today?
yeah, pretty much.
So you were thinking about going to get your brother's gun and shooting everybody up?
Yeah.
Scott was charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder as a juvenile, but the prosecution said they were wanting to have him charged as an adult. That decision was up to the judge, but Scott appeared in court on the 4th of January, where he was told he would remain in custody. 3 days later, Mary was laid to rest. Around 200 mourners filled St. Jerome Roman Catholic Church to bid her one final farewell. The following day, Stephen, Linda and Brittany were laid to rest as well. Their joint funeral was in the same church where Mary had been eulogised just 24 hours earlier. During the service, Reverend Michael Butler said that the family were good in every category that counts. He drew a laugh from the mourners as he said about Stephen: "A good husband, good provider, good friend. A big guy, athletic guy, hard-working and a Yankee fan. Maybe his only shortcoming." He remembered Linda as a devoted mother whose whole life was dedicated to her children. As for Brittany, he said that she was a hard worker just like her parents. As the caskets were carried from the church, Stephen Jr. followed. He was carrying a picture of his father. Linda's oldest son, Jonathan, clutched tightly to a photograph of her. There were no public developments in the case until November of 2019. There had been a gag order on the case, but on the 15th it was announced that Scott was facing his charges in adult court. His attorney, Richard Lamuro, shared his displeasure, stating, "We had extensive expert reports submitted to the court to support our position that this should have stayed in the juvenile division. However, now that it's an adult case, we will be prepared to investigate and represent Scott to the full extent." His defence attorney subsequently tried to have him sent to a secure psychiatric facility pending trial. He said that Scott had only been formally diagnosed as being autistic and having hallucinations when a court-appointed doctor evaluated him in the past 6 months. That doctor, Dr. Daniel Greenfield, recommended that Scott undergo a brain MRI scan, but that couldn't be done in jail. The defence argued, "My client has been in juvenile detention for 2 years with 0 treatment. He's not going to go free. He's not going to be walking down the street." However, prosecutor Barbara Suppa argued back and said that Scott should remain incarcerated. She said that he had methodically planned the murders and had reported violent thoughts and urges. She stated, "Scott acted in a calculated, premeditated and a very sophisticated manner in the commission of these crimes." Judge Joseph Oxley ultimately refused the request for Scott to be released, stating, "Release is not recommended because of the risk and potential danger he would pose to the community." Then in January, Scott returned to court where he pleaded not guilty to all of the charges against him, setting the stage for the upcoming murder trial. The question of who exactly had committed the murders wasn't going to be the focus of the trial. It wasn't a whodunit, Scott had confessed. Instead, the crux of the case was going to hinge on whether Scott could understand what he had done and whether he understood that it was wrong. Both the defence and the prosecution had hired experts to analyse Scott, and they had both reached varying conclusions on his frame of mind. In the preceding 4 years, Scott had received less and less visits in jail from his surviving family members. His brother Stephen Jr. had tried to keep a connection, but that got more difficult as time passed. He said in the media, "It was actually easier in the beginning, because of the shock of it all, and we're still family. It wasn't till later that I kind of grew some animosity, but we're still going with helping him overall." Stephen Jr. also shared that the family wanted Scott to get help, not punishment, because that's what their mother would have wanted. While Scott had been the closest with his grandfather Adrian, he hadn't visited him once. Scott told the counsellor in February of 2018 that his grandfather didn't want to see him. The murder trial finally began on the 9th of February 2022. During the opening statements, defence attorney Emeka Nwigwe described Scott as a mentally ill child who never got the treatment he needed. He said that at the time of the murders, Scott had autism and undiagnosed schizophrenia that was rapidly getting worse. Prosecutor Caitlin Sidley maintained during her opening arguments that Scott knew what he was doing when he loaded 15 bullets each into 2 magazines and then placed them in the rifle. On the first day of the trial, survivors of the shooting testified about what had happened. Stephen Jr. testified that his family was close-knit. He said his mother had doted on Scott and his father had just started a new job as a truck driver. He spoke about his relationship with his younger brother, recalling how he often let him win basketball matches and awarded him with trophies just to make him feel better. He spoke about the moment that gunfire erupted in the home.
I started running, but besides me was my dad, and we were running side by side actually, but I went to the front door and he went upstairs. And then that's where I stayed.
So when your dad runs upstairs, what happens next?
I hear more shots.
And at that point, you still think those are gunshots, right?
Correct.
Okay. So then what happens next?
I stay at the front door, and I'm at the front door and I'm looking in, and I eventually see Scott coming down the stairs.
When you see him coming down the stairs, how is he walking?
Casually.
Casually. Okay. What is he wearing?
He was wearing his Halloween costume from the prior Halloween.
Under cross-examination by defence attorney Richard Lamuro, Stephen Jr. acknowledged that he hugged Scott and told him he loved him and that his parents loved him, just 2 hours after the murders. Linda's oldest son, Jonathan, also spoke about Scott. He said that he still slept in bed with his mother and father and still believed in Santa Claus. When he was asked how he knew that, he responded, "Because I would help hide presents in the attic so that he would believe that Santa bought them and the presents were tagged Santa." Jonathan had been at the family's home on New Year's Eve, but he had left before the shooting. He said to the courtroom that Scott appeared to be happy during the day. Testimony was then presented from family about Scott's dark thoughts, with his aunt Michelle telling the jury how he wanted to speak with his therapist about wanting to kill the family. She said that Linda forbade him from speaking about his thoughts or feelings, and even forbade Michelle from telling anybody the kind of things that Scott had said. She testified, "Linda told me, 'You never know what will happen if you say anything. Not only will you be put out, but you will never see my kids again.'" Michelle was the only family member that still visited Scott in jail, and she said she often asked him why he did what he did. He told her that she would need to wait and read it in his book. He said he wanted to name his book Scot-Free, because when he gets away with it, he would be scot-free. The jury then got to watch Scott's confession, following with Detective Andrea Tozzi testifying. She said that Scott told her and Detective Verdadero that he had been experiencing hallucinations since he was 7 or 8. However, he told her that he wasn't hearing voices on the day of the murders. She said, he knew who he was shooting. He referred to them as his mother, his father, his grandmother Mary, and his sister Brittany. Furthermore, Scott had told the detectives that he had researched how to use the AK-47 earlier in the week. He also explained that he turned the lights off before he shot his mother because he didn't want her to see what he was about to do. Otherwise, he would have snapped out of it. The defence attorney asked her what Scott said when she asked him if he didn't want to be snapped out of it. She quoted Scott as saying, "I don't know. I guess I was all over the place, but at that point, I was kind of gone mentally." She further testified that Scott told them that he had told his grandfather and mother about his hallucinations, but neither of them reached out to a psychiatrist. After Scott had been arrested, he spoke with Dr. Maureen Santina, and she told the courtroom about the hallucinations he reportedly had. She said he told her one day he was lying in bed and saw a woman laying there that appeared to be human. However, her eyes then turned red and she developed long, sharp teeth and turned black, as if she had been burned. Dr. Santina testified he told her that on the morning of the shootings, something was wrong from the moment he woke up. He said that while he was showering that morning, he heard a voice say, "Welcome to the side of evil." Dr. Santina believed that Scott was displaying an increasing indication of mental illness over several months. It was her belief that on the day of the shootings, it was reaching a head. She didn't believe that he was malingering or fabricating his hallucinations and diagnosed him with early onset schizophrenia. The psychologist said that Scott didn't know the wrongfulness of his actions. However, she did tell the court that about a month before the murders, he had researched the difference between serial killers and mass murderers. She said his takeaway from it was that they both had high IQs. The prosecution sought to cast doubt on the insanity defence, with prosecutor Brennan playing portions of Scott's confession. In it, he said that he was nervous as he loaded the gun. When he was asked why he was nervous, he responded, "I'm going to be in trouble." The detective then asked, "So you knew it was wrong?" Scott responded, Yeah. The prosecution then called on Dr. Park Dietz, a nationally renowned forensic psychiatrist most known for testifying as a prosecution witness during the trial of Jeffrey Dahmer and the Menendez brothers. His rate was $1,200 an hour, but government cases had a discounted rate of $800 an hour because it involved the public's money. He had interviewed Scott at length and told the courtroom how Scott had been thinking about killing his family for some time. However, he said it was only after he was arrested that he spoke about hearing evil voices. He had told detectives during his interrogation he had heard voices as a child, but never mentioned hearing voices on the day of the murder until much later. Furthermore, he had never mentioned previously that he thought his family were out to get him. Those comments only came after he was charged with the murders. He testified, "It's important to him to be able to live with what he's done, and if he can blame it on mental illness, that's easier on him than taking responsibility for it." Dr. Dietz said he didn't believe that Scott suffered from schizophrenia, like the defence expert had suggested. Instead, he said he was on the high-functioning end of the autism spectrum. However, he acknowledged that on the day of the shootings, he entered a kind of dissociative state of depersonalisation. He said to the courtroom, "I reached the opinion that at the time the defendant was preparing for these events, the time leading up to these events, the defendant was capable of deliberating." He believed that Scott knew and appreciated the nature and quality of his actions. In short, he knew what he was doing and he knew that it was wrong. After that, the defence had Scott stand up in court.
This is Scott Kologi. Okay, we've heard a lot of people throughout this trial talk about him as if he's not here. He's here. This is Scott. This is Jonathan's brother. This is Steven's brother. This is Michelle's nephew. This is Richie's nephew. This is Grandma Carol's grandson. This is Scott Kologi, and he was born with a mental illness. Thank you, Scott.
Defence attorney Lamoro said during his closing arguments, "We're not debating that this happened. It did happen. Scott shot his family." However, he said that the tragedy was not born from wickedness, but instead sickness. He spoke about the voices that Scott allegedly heard telling the jury. He couldn't stop them. Scott tried to ignore them, but he couldn't. Prosecutor Brennan, during his closing argument, said that their focus was on the facts of the case. He stated, "Those facts tell you time and time again that this defendant knew exactly what he was doing. He was aware of what he was doing. He was responsible for the choices he made." He said that Scott had threatened to do exactly what he did, and that showed intent. He also touched on the premeditated nature, reminding the jury that Scott admitted he had watched videos on how to load the weapon and use it. After just 1 hour of deliberation, the jury returned to the courtroom with a verdict. Scott Kologi was found guilty on all charges, including 4 counts of murder, rejecting his insanity defence. The swift decision came as a heavy blow to Scott's defence, which had argued that his mental health struggles should be considered in the case. Outside of court, Scott's defence attorney, Al Lamuro, commented on the broader implications of the case. He said, "This is a case that needed to be tried. A jury needed to make this case a lesson about mental health, gun safety and open minds, making sure people get mental health treatment before this happens." The sentencing phase of the trial began on June the 30th. Judge Mark Lameau addressed Scott directly, stating that the evidence against him was overwhelming. With the weight of the case resting heavily on the courtroom, the judge delivered a sentence of 150 years in prison. He mandated that Scott must serve at least 85% of that time before he was eligible for parole. Effectively, Scott Kologi would spend the rest of his life in prison. Prosecutor Sean Brennan spoke bluntly during the proceedings, summing up the gravity of Scott's actions. He said, "These were acts of evil, carried out by someone who knew exactly what he was doing. He killed them because he could. He killed them because he wanted to." Well, besties, that is it for this episode of Morbidology. As always, thank you so much for listening, and I'd like to say a massive thank you to my newest supporter up on Patreon, Lauren. The link to Patreon is in the show notes if you'd like to join. I upload ad-free and early release episodes behind the scenes, and I also send out merch and a handwritten thank you card. I also do bonus episodes of Morbidology Plus, but I'll admit I'm a little bit behind on those. With the pregnancy, I spent pretty much all of my time getting ahead with the free show, but once I'm settled and into a proper routine again, I'll be back making more bonus episodes. So thank you for your patience. I hope that everybody had a great holiday and got some time off work or school and got to spend some time with your loved ones. And I also hope that everybody has an amazing new year. Remember to check us out at morbidology.com for more information about this episode and to read some true crime articles. Until next time, take care of yourselves, stay safe, and have an amazing week.